Right, thank you, everyone. Really glad to be with you here today. Like Anne said, my name is Maddie Mercer, and I work with the City of Tempe's Sustainability and Resilience Office. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit about our Rain to Roots Master Plan. Next slide. So before I jump into the work, I did want to give a little bit of some context about our team, some updates in terms of staff. So many of you may have known our former director, Dr. Braden Kay, who founded our office in the city of Tempe. He has moved on. He now works with the governor's office in California, doing some great heat-related work. But within that, we have a new director, Eric Iverson, and some additional new staff who have joined our team as well. So we have our director, Eric. Brianne is our climate action manager. And then we have 4 coordinator staff, including myself, our newest, who's on the call and is now renamed Carissa, not Maddie, as our new heat mitigation and resilience coordinator. And then we have a 5th coordinator who will focus on policy and grants coming on board soon. Next slide. So really our work within the Sustainability and Resilience Office is driven by our Climate Action Plan update, which was adopted by City Council in March of 2022. So in the past, our first Climate Action Plan really focused on municipal actions, and this updated version really sought to center residents' voices and community partnerships in our climate action work. So with this new action plan, we have 4 agendas that outline different areas of climate action work, focusing on youth, businesses, climate justice, and neighborhoods. And it's within this neighborhoods agenda that really sought to address extreme heat through green stormwater infrastructure and green codes and standards. So this master plan is really a result of the identification of these solutions from community. Next slide. So why green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI? We're really interested in GSI from the City of Tempe's perspective because of its benefits to tree canopy, its ability to help reduce temperatures and potable water use while supporting more vegetation, its ability to help mitigate some nuisance flooding and promotion of cleaner waterways, and really creating wildlife habitat and bringing green spaces back into our urban settings that provide a lot of ecosystem benefits and work in ways that help cool our city and create more comfortable environments. And Jesse is going to go through some of those in more detail.
Yeah, so just touching on some of those pieces and giving a little bit more examples. For example, on our Eco Phoenix project, our big focus was focusing on the root zone and how do we create enough rooting space for the trees to reach maturity. So what we did in the process was have these pedestrian bridges that keeps the compaction off the root zone, and those are spaced, 30 feet on center where every tree is located. So then the root system has more to grow into it. Go ahead, next slide. And then touching on reducing temperatures with Watershed Management Group, the Primera Iglesia Church project. This thing was phased going from 2010, 11, kind of till today because we still have maintenance happening on it. But where this right away was, devoid of any kind of life, what you see here is without irrigation, using curb cuts and curb cores, the native vegetation is allowed to grow into it. And now you have this shaded canopy as you move through the site and the sidewalk. Next slide. So reducing potable water use, that could be from just the amount of natural rainwater that we're harvesting offsite or using from the roof. But we could also look at, gray water use from a shower. So for example, on Dragonfly Creek, actually on this project, we use a mix of everything. So what you're looking at here is the irrigation system, which captures shower water, and then that's used for the irrigation for a large portion of the site. It also takes water from the roof into a cistern, and it also uses the gray water from the laundry machine. Next slide. So GSI also mitigates flooding on the Pima County Consolidated Justice Court down in Tucson. We used curb cuts along the cycle track. And what that helps too is just making sure that that water, as it's coming down, you actually have some room to ride your bicycle in. And then we're pushing that back through the landscape. All right, next slide. So for Monroe Avenue and Buckeye, we're talking about promotes cleaner waterways. The slide on the left is the water that's going into the, sometimes you call it a chicane, WMG, the standard was calling this a chicane. Other times you call it a curb extension or a bump out. And the point of this is it's not capturing all of the rainwater, but what it does is catching that first flush system and helping to clean out those pollutants as it's going into it. So here you can see as the water is going in, it's kind of a darker, it's got more sediment into it. It's got some oils and things from the road. And then when you go through this whole vegetative bioswale picture on the right, then you can see how much cleaner the water is when it's coming out on the other end. Again, we're not capturing all of it. What we're trying to do is just reduce that pollutant load. Next slide. And when you add all these pieces together, then you're going to notice kind of like creating a bigger wildlife habitat. You're going to have more things that are working on your site. Go ahead, next slide.
All right, so we heard about some of these benefits and we see a clear interest from the community members in green stormwater infrastructure. How are we going to address it? Our approach is through this Rain to Roots master plan, which is really focused on three core things. The first is just generally expanding green infrastructure and cooling initiatives around the city. The second is really trying to focus on creating connections across departments that touch stormwater, urban cooling, urban greening, and coming up with ways that we could work together so that our strategies are supporting each other, and then identifying opportunities to fund this work moving forward. So within the scope of this master plan, we see a lot of opportunity for integrating GSI in different right-of-ways, multi-use paths, parks, neighborhoods, private development, many different areas that we want to explore through this work and identify ways that we can fund project in these zones into the future. Next slide. So in this project, we have many different partners, and we are adding to this list each day. So like I said, a big focus of this master plan is on internal integration of all of the different teams that touch on stormwater, water conservation, sustainability, and urban greening, and as well as our external partners like Jesse at Work and our other consultants, Greeley and Hansen and Raptelis, as well as Tempe residents, businesses, the commission, and just users of these landscapes and opportunity areas that I outlined in the last slide. Next slide. So at a high level, these squares each outline one of the core buckets of this master planning work. So the first phase was really focused on assessing the current state of our stormwater system and urban greening and urban cooling initiatives within the city. Then we are also focusing a lot on green codes and standards and thinking about how policy needs to be adjusted to better support this work across the city. There's going to be an update of the urban forestry master plan that was first adopted in 2017 as part of this larger master planning effort. And then we're also going to be pursuing some funding strategies and identifying ways that we can promote GSI in the future. And then these four buckets will all feed into pilot projects that we'll be designing throughout this master planning process to really showcase each of these areas of focus, and then also tie into the public outreach that we're doing to really build a strong sense of support within the community for green stormwater infrastructure. Okay. Next slide. So I'll start off, like I said, the first phase of this work was really focused on assessing our current stormwater management and urban forestry, heat mitigation, and sustainability practices. So we looked at different data, policies and programs and infrastructures that exist within the city to get a sense of where we're at right now and where we need to go in terms of different programs, policy changes, and infrastructure investments. And as we move into this next phase, we're really going to build on our understanding of each of these areas and start developing recommendations in partnership with our consultant team to help further each of these. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jesse, who will talk a little bit more about how his team helped to assess our current state of infrastructure in projects in Tempe.
So in assessing the current state, we looked at 25 different actual sites that were both public and private development to kind of see where the city was at. And one of the big pieces was to actually go out, when it's hot out. So one of the big trips we did was June 28th, right when it's, nice and cool out, and trying to see how the the existing conditions or its bikeways or the connectedness in city of Tempe, how those pieces work together. Where was the hot spots? What did it actually feel like being on site? So go ahead, go to the next slide. And when we're looking at these pieces, we're looking at everything from the GSI pieces that were involved in it. We're looking at how people are using the spaces. And one of the projects that we looked at was Mountain Park Health Center. So this was a private development project on the northeast corner of McClintock and Broadway. And this had a pretty good, overall view of it. Was they're they're touching a lot of points and hitting a lot of buttons that were involved with GSI. And some pieces were just missing it. So go ahead, hit the next slide. So for example, in the parking lots where you have a system where you've got curb cuts, and the whole point of that is, okay, we're going to bring water off the parking lot, bring it into the landscape. But, gravity being what it is, water doesn't go uphill. So where you'd want to see this curb cut acting where the water could fill up that entire planter, instead it's just hitting that small piece where it's going into it. And then looking at, as I touched on before, was, okay, if we need 1,000 cubic feet of soil for each tree, well, how can we accomplish that when the landscape planter is smaller? How can we look at using structural soil or silvicells or something of that matter? Go to the next slide. So again, this is, probably just a miscommunication between the landscape and the civil engineer. You've got water going into the planter, but then your water catchment device is immediately right there. So all the point of doing this is being mitigated and lost because it's not going into the landscape. Go ahead, go next slide.
Right. So like Jesse just showed with that last picture, we're really in our assessment of the current state, thinking about how existing policy and codes, or how existing codes and standards are impacting our ability to maximize the benefits of GSI, and thinking about the kinds of programs and trainings and alterations that need to be made to really make these features work to their best potential. So moving forward in the master planning process, like I mentioned, we'll be updating the urban forestry master plan with new recommendations for programs and policies, looking at things like a tree banking system and code updates, and in addition to updating our tree canopy maps. Next slide.
So one of the big pieces of this is, how do we encourage people to do the right thing? So, from an education standpoint, as you can see in the top right corner, I mean, yeah, those are trees, those are Palo Verdes that have been trimmed into something from Dr. Seuss. How can we make sure that those things they actually become the trees and you get that benefit of the things that we were talking about at the very beginning? And also looking at, okay, so for every site, there's some kind of water retention requirement, correct? So how can we use that to the benefit of, instead of just like, let's say, using a dry well and putting the water underground, we could use that for, a cistern and collecting rainwater off the roof, and that counts towards your water retention requirements. Or how can we ease the system of using gray water from, let's say, laundries or showers, and using that to feed our landscape? And in the bottom right picture, it's looking at, again, we're going back to how can we create in an urban environment 1,000 cubic feet of soil for a tree to survive. So on the bottom right, that's a project that we were doing in Mesa. It's an Eco Mesa project where we had some pretty tiny planters, but in the orange and the green, we use structural soil. So in order for the root system to pound through underneath the concrete, then it can reach into more landscape areas. Again, we're trying to push in, like, hey, it's not about $1,000 tree and a $10 hole. What we want is almost a $10 tree and a $1,000 hole to make sure that our trees can reach maturity. Next slide. So what we were talking about was the private development side, and then also a city standard side on creating these avenues to kind of push things forward. So, and again, when we're talking about this, is that we're not trying to just throw away everything that we've built on over the last like 10, 20 years. We've come a long ways, and every stage of this we're learning from. When we're putting the green infrastructure handbook together, when we're looking at the city of Mesa, their LID toolkit, what we're learning down in Tucson, right? We're doing things and we're learning about it for 5 years, maintenance side. Okay, here's how we need to revise it. Okay, let's get a new game plan going. So what we want to do is just keep building on everything that we've learned over the last couple of decades and just keep moving the standard forward. Next slide.
Yeah, what Jesse just mentioned on building on past work is really, really essential to this master plan. So it's our attempt at identifying those best practices and helping to integrate them and make them easier to implement within the city of Tempe. And with that, we want to identify ways that we can fund this work moving forward so that we can continue to innovate and implement projects that demonstrate these best practices. So a major part of this master plan is a feasibility study that will look to identify alternative ways to fund green stormwater infrastructure, potentially in the form of an urban cooling and stormwater utility that could build on the recently established stormwater fee that was set by the water rate study in 2022. And so we're going to be developing some scenarios for outlining what this fee could look like and how it could grow over time. So it could be implemented through a phased approach that could help build the funds and meet existing funding needs where there's gaps. So helping to pay for our regulatory compliance needs, as well as wanting to build on projects in the future. So implementing new GSI projects in those areas of opportunity that we see. And in that, these are some pictures from our trip to Tucson at the bottom of this slide. And I put them as a reminder of some of the different areas that we hope to address through this work and potentially through this funding strategy. So thinking about education in schools and in neighborhoods, integration of workforce development and green job opportunities, thinking about maintenance as a best practice and how we can implement it in both private and public development, and really creating projects that demonstrate this work around the city so that we can build a culture of excitement around green stormwater infrastructure and get people engaged in the process of co-creating what our landscape looks and feels like. Next slide. So part of that work is focused on building pilot projects. So helping us to really bridge the current state. So we have this analysis of what our current programs and infrastructure looks like. So bridging that current state with our future state that we want to create. So demonstrating how GSI can be integrated in different types of projects, whether it's parks or right-of-ways or private development, to really inspire people and show them that this is a viable alternative to integrate into whatever type of development that they may be planning. And it also gives us a testing ground for those new codes and standards and practices, and to really help with that integration piece so that we can create pilot projects that don't just, provide shade and address our urban forestry and canopy coverage goals, but also help us promote water quality with environmental services and connections to other areas of the city, whether it's transportation or other systems that we want to really integrate through this work. Next slide. So as part of our outreach work for the Range Roots Master Plan, we have launched an ambassador program. So this is really focused on trying to bring public in and create, like I said, that community around GSI and urban cooling, and giving residents a platform to help advise the direction of the policies and program recommendations that we'll be putting together throughout this master planning process. So it also provides people who are attending a chance to learn more about that current state, about what the city is already doing in terms of stormwater management and water conservation and sustainability and urban forestry, and then help us decide and shape what the future of the city will look like through our new programs and initiatives. So there'll be opportunities for participants in the program to review the recommendations and memos, and also to help shape the pilot projects that we'll be designing as part of this initiative. And we will have monthly meetings. We just had our kickoff last week, 2 weeks ago, and we had about 25 attendees show up who are really excited to see this work expand. And by now, we actually have 45 registered ambassadors who will be following this work and just helping to promote and advocate for GSI. and the application is rolling. So if anyone is Tempe resident and wants to voice their support for this master plan and this work, you're welcome to join us at our meetings on the first Wednesday of the month, 5:30 to 6:30. They'll be hybrid. Next slide. And with that, I want to spend just a moment talking about kind of the next phase of this work. So we just wrapped this assessment of the current state where we interviewed different city internal partners, external partners, and tried to assess what's happening right now in the city in terms of stormwater management and urban greening. We're going to take that understanding and apply it to the identification of pilot projects that we can use to demonstrate these new best practices and existing best practices that we're integrating through this work. So we're working on integrating some of the data that was assessed through that first stage to create a GIS map that outlines areas of prioritization in terms of heat and equity, flooding, and other concerns that we're adding in terms of stormwater management and sustainability prioritization. And then we're also going to be developing some initial program recommendations and scenarios for that utility feasibility piece so that we can begin thinking about what the other master planning documents will look like and what are some of our kind of guidelines for the types of programs that we can fund based on the different scenarios and how they play out. So as a whole, the project will end up with a master plan that will consist of some pilot project designs, some new city codes and standards that we'll be proposing, an updated urban forestry master plan, and a strategy for funding this work moving forward. And with that, we will take any of your questions.